The text arrived at 11:48 p.m., a single notification on a phone that existed only for criminal enterprises and coded orders. But this message was different. It was written by a child's trembling fingers. "He's beating my mama. Help, please." Lorenzo Hale, the most feared man in New York's underworld, stared at the glowing screen in his penthouse office. His first instinct was dismissal. Wrong number. A scam, some desperate fool fishing for sympathy. Then the second message appeared, accompanied by an address he recognized from another lifetime. "Please hurry. He's looking for me." Lorenzo's chest tightened in a way it hadn't for 30 years. He had orchestrated violence. He had become violence. But this raw, innocent terror, this child's plea sent to a stranger's phone, cut through every layer of ice he'd built around his soul. His thumbs moved across the screen. Only 2 words. "I'm on my way." The room fell silent as Lorenzo stood, buttoning his navy suit jacket with mechanical precision. His guards exchanged bewildered glances as he strode toward the elevator. "Boss, what's happening? Where are you going?" He didn't respond. He couldn't explain what he didn't understand himself, that something ancient and dormant had awakened inside him. Something that felt disturbingly like his mother's dying whisper from 3 decades ago. God will send help to the helpless, even if the helper is broken. His SUV carved through Manhattan's midnight streets, tires screaming against asphalt. Another message illuminated his phone on the dashboard. "I'm hiding in the closet. I can hear him coming upstairs." Lorenzo's knuckles went white against the steering wheel. His pulse, usually steady even during executions, hammered against his ribs. Red lights became suggestions. Speed limits ceased to exist. When he finally pulled onto that residential street, the address glowing on his GPS, he already understood. Tonight, he wasn't arriving as a mafia boss, as New York's most wanted, as the man who'd buried his conscience with his mother. He was arriving as the answer to a 4-year-old boy's desperate prayer. And what Lorenzo discovered inside that house, in that blood-stained living room, would shatter the monster he'd become and resurrect the boy he'd buried in a closet 30 years ago. Stay until the end. Because the moment Lorenzo finds Noah hiding in that same closet where he once hid will break you and heal you in ways you never expected. Before we begin, hit that like button, subscribe for stories that touch the soul, and comment where you're watching from, and if you believe in divine appointments. But to understand why those 4 words shattered Lorenzo Hale's carefully constructed walls, why a simple text from a terrified child could resurrect 30 years of buried trauma, we need to go back to a different night, a different house, a different little boy hiding in a different closet, listening to screams he was too small to stop. Back to the moment Lorenzo Hale's childhood ended and the monster was born. The year was 1995. An 8-year-old Lorenzo pressed his small body into the corner of his mother's closet, hands clamped over his ears, trying to block out the sounds that would haunt him forever. His father's drunken roars, his mother's pleading, the sickening thuds of fist against flesh. He'd prayed that night, whispered desperate words into the darkness. "Please God, send someone. Send anyone. Save her." No one came. His mother took her last breath 3 hours later, whispering words that would echo through decades. God will send help to the helpless, even if the helper is broken. Lorenzo never prayed again after that night. He buried the terrified boy in that closet and built a fortress of violence and power over his grave. Until tonight, until a 4-year-old named Noah Parker crouched in his own closet, his small hands pressed together, whispering the only prayer his mama had taught him. "Jesus, please help my mama. Please send someone. Please, please, please." Outside the closet door, heavy footsteps thundered across the 2nd floor. Shane's voice, thick with rage and something darker, cut through the house. "Where are you, you little brat? You think you can hide from me? I'm gonna find you. And when I do..." The threat hung unfinished in the air, but Noah understood it perfectly. He'd seen what Shane's hands could do. He'd watched his mama's face change colors, watched her try to smile through split lips and swollen eyes. Noah squeezed his eyes shut tighter and prayed harder. his small voice barely a whisper in the darkness. 3 miles away, Lorenzo's SUV carved through the night like a blade. 2 more vehicles followed, filled with his most trusted men, but Lorenzo had already made the decision that confused them all. He was going in alone. "Boss, at least let us clear the perimeter," his captain urged through the radio. Lorenzo didn't respond. His hands gripped the steering wheel with enough force to make his knuckles ache. In his mind, 2 timelines merged and blurred. The child hiding now. The child he'd been then. The screams then. The screams now. The SUV screeched to a halt in front of a modest 2-story house that looked like any other on the block. Quiet. Normal. The kind of place where nightmares happened behind closed curtains and no one called the police because they didn't want to get involved. Lorenzo stepped out of the vehicle, his expensive shoes touching pavement that cracked beneath streetlight shadows. His guards moved to follow, but he raised one hand, a simple gesture that carried the weight of absolute authority. "Stay here." "But boss," I said, "stay." As he walked toward the house, something shifted in the air around him. The rage he'd carried for 30 years, the cold precision that had made him legendary in the underworld, all of it suddenly felt inadequate for this moment. His chest burned with something he couldn't name, something that felt disturbingly like the prayers he'd abandoned decades ago. Then he heard it. Not with his ears, but deeper. A whisper that could have been memory, or could have been something else entirely. "Break the cycle." His mother's voice, clear as the night she died. Lorenzo's jaw clenched. His hand touched the door handle, and he pushed. The door wasn't locked. It swung open on protesting hinges, revealing devastation. The living room looked like a war zone. Furniture overturned. A lamp shattered against the far wall. Family photos lay scattered across the floor, glass crunching under Lorenzo's feet as he stepped inside. And there, near the base of the stairs, a woman's body lay motionless in a pool of spreading crimson. Grace. She was breathing, barely, her chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. Blood matted her blonde hair. Her face was a canvas of purple and red. Lorenzo's vision blurred. For a moment, he wasn't looking at Grace. He was looking at his mother. Same position, same broken angle of her limbs, same expression of someone who'd fought and lost. His knees threatened to buckle. 30 years of walls, of carefully constructed emotional armor, cracked. Then he heard movement upstairs. Heavy footsteps, a man's voice, slurred and venomous. Come out, wherever you are, you little rat. Your mama can't protect you now." Something ancient and primal surged through Lorenzo's veins. He moved toward the stairs with predatory silence, each step deliberate, controlled. His hands slipped inside his jacket, fingers finding the cold steel of his weapon. Shane appeared at the top of the stairs, a kitchen knife glinting in his grip. His eyes were wild, unfocused, the eyes of a man who'd crossed a line and decided to keep running. When he saw Lorenzo, he froze for only a second. "Who the hell are you?" Lorenzo didn't answer. He ascended the stairs with terrifying calm, closing the distance between them with each measured step. Shane raised the knife, his hand shaking. His bravado cracked around the edges. "I said who?" Shane lunged. It was over in 3 seconds. Lorenzo moved with the precision of a man who'd survived 1,000 fights, who'd turned violence into an art form. He caught Shane's wrist mid-strike, twisted, and the knife clattered across the hardwood floor. A single blow to the solar plexus dropped Shane to his knees, gasping. Lorenzo stood over him, his weapon now drawn and pressed against Shane's temple. One pull of the trigger. One moment. Justice for Grace. Justice for his mother. Justice for every helpless person who'd ever prayed for a savior who didn't come. His finger tightened on the trigger. "Do it," a voice in his head urged. "End him. He deserves it." But another voice whispered beneath the rage. Softer. Familiar. "Break the cycle." Lorenzo's hand trembled, sweat beaded on his forehead. Every instinct screamed to finish this, to paint these walls with the same violence Shane had inflicted. Then he heard it. A tiny voice, muffled by a closet door down the hall. Mister, are you here to save us? Lorenzo froze. The voice shattered something fundamental inside him. It sounded like his own voice from 30 years ago, like the prayer he'd whispered into darkness while his mother died, like the child he'd buried and the man he'd become colliding in a single moment of impossible clarity. His weapon lowered, just slightly. Shane sensed the hesitation and tried to move, but Lorenzo's knee pressed into his spine, pinning him to the floor. The closet door was 5 feet away. Lorenzo could see it trembling slightly, could hear the soft whimper of a child trying to be brave. He looked down at Shane, then at the closet, then at his own hands. Still steady despite the earthquake happening inside his soul. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that transcended threat. It was a promise, a vow, an announcement of judgment. You have 24 hours to disappear from New York. If I ever see your face again, they'll never find enough of you to bury. He released Shane, who scrambled backward, bleeding and gasping. Lorenzo turned toward the closet. His weapon disappeared back into his jacket. His hands, which had dealt death for decades, suddenly felt inadequate for this moment. He knelt in front of the closet door. His reflection stared back at him from the full-length mirror across the hall. A man in an expensive suit. A monster in human skin. A broken savior arriving 30 years too late for one child, but just in time for another. His voice, when it came, was softer than it had been in 30 years. Yes, kid. The closet door opened slowly, revealing a small figure pressed into the corner beneath hanging coats. Noah's tear-streaked face emerged from the shadows, his eyes wide and red, his small body trembling like a leaf in a storm. For a moment, neither moved. Man and child, separated by 30 years and united by the same terror, the same desperate prayer, whispered into darkness. Lorenzo extended his hand, palm up, an offering of safety. It's okay now. The explosion of movement came from behind. Shane, bleeding and desperate, had found his knife. He charged with the wild energy of a cornered animal, all survival instinct and murderous rage. The blade arced toward Lorenzo's back. Lorenzo spun with fluid precision, muscle memory from 1,000 street fights taking over. He caught Shane's wrist mid-strike, twisted until bone ground against bone, and the knife fell for the second time. Before Shane could scream, Lorenzo drove him backward into the hallway wall with enough force to crack the drywall. Shane's head snapped back, his eyes rolled. But he was still conscious, still fighting, still clawing at Lorenzo's suit jacket with desperate fingers. Lorenzo's fist cocked back. One punch, just one. With the full weight of his fury, his childhood trauma, his mother's death behind it, one punch would end this. Shane's skull would fracture. His brain would hemorrhage. Justice would be served in the only language Lorenzo had spoken for 30 years. Violence. His knuckles aligned with Shane's temple. Every muscle in his body coiled for the strike. His jaw clenched. His vision narrowed to a single point of impact. Then the whisper came again, louder this time, impossible to ignore. Don't become your father. Lorenzo's fist trembled in the air, suspended between vengeance and mercy. Don't become your father. His mother's voice, clear, unmistakable, as real as the blood on his hands and the child watching from the closet. Lorenzo's breathing came in ragged gasps. Sweat dripped from his brow onto Shane's terrified face. Every cell in his body screamed to finish this. To cross the line he'd crossed 100 times before, but something held him back. Something beyond reason or logic or the cold calculations that had governed his life since he was 8 years old. It felt like hands on his shoulders, gentle, restraining. His mother's hands, the air around him grew thick, heavy with presence. The hallway lights flickered. Lorenzo's vision blurred at the edges, and for one impossible moment, he wasn't in this house. He was somewhere else, somewhere between memory and vision, between past and present. He saw himself, 8 years old, standing over his father's body years later, gun in hand, finally strong enough to deliver the justice he'd been denied as a child. He saw the moment he'd pulled that trigger, the moment he'd become the very thing he'd feared. The moment he'd become his father's son. No. His mother's voice whispered through the vision. You were supposed to be my son. Break the cycle, Lorenzo. Break it now. Or it breaks you forever. Lorenzo's hand lowered. Slowly. Trembling. Fighting against every instinct. Every lesson the streets had taught him. Every scar on his soul that demanded blood for blood. Shane slumped against the wall, gasping, his face a mask of terror and confusion. Lorenzo's voice, when it came, carried the weight of divine judgment. 24 hours. Disappear from New York, from the state, from their lives. If I ever see your face, if I ever hear your name, if you ever think about coming back. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a whisper that promised horrors worse than death. They will never find all of you. He released Shane, who collapsed to the floor like a puppet with cut strings. Lorenzo pulled out his phone with shaking hands and pressed a single button. His men's voices crackled through immediately. Second floor, remove the trash, quietly. He has 24 hours to vanish. His guards appeared within seconds, moving with efficient silence. They hauled Shane to his feet, his protest dying in his throat when he saw the dead-eyed professionalism of Lorenzo's crew. These men had disappeared people before. Shane understood implicitly that he was being given a gift he didn't deserve. His life? The house fell silent as they dragged Shane down the stairs and out into the night. Lorenzo stood alone in the hallway, his hands still trembling, his chest heaving like he'd run a marathon. He'd spared a life. For the first time in 22 years, he'd chosen mercy over vengeance. It felt like dying and being born in the same breath. A small sound drew his attention back to the closet. Noah had emerged fully now, standing in the doorway with his colorful pajamas and tear-stained cheeks. His small hand reached out and clutched Lorenzo's pant leg, tiny fingers gripping the expensive fabric like a lifeline. Lorenzo looked down at him, and something fundamental broke inside his chest. The walls he'd built, the armor he'd worn, the monster he'd become. All of it cracked and crumbled under the weight of one small child's trust. Tears fell from Lorenzo's eyes for the first time in 30 years. They came silently at first, hot tracks down his scarred face. Then his shoulders shook. Then his knees buckled, and he found himself kneeling on the floor, eye level with the boy he'd saved, unable to stop the flood of 3 decades of buried grief. Noah didn't pull away. Instead, he stepped closer and wrapped his small arms around Lorenzo's neck. It's okay, mister, Mama says. Crying means you're healing. Lorenzo's arms encircled the child carefully, as if he might break. He couldn't speak, couldn't breathe properly, could only kneel there in the hallway of a stranger's house and finally grieve for the boy he'd been and the mother he'd lost. When he could finally move again, Lorenzo stood and walked downstairs. Grace lay where he'd found her, barely breathing. Her pulse was weak but steady beneath his fingers when he checked. He lifted her with surprising gentleness, cradling her against his chest like something precious and fragile. Noah followed close behind, his small hand gripping Lorenzo's jacket. Outside, an ambulance waited, its lights dark, its crew already paid to forget what they'd seen and treat whom they'd treated. Lorenzo had made the call during the confrontation upstairs. Money and fear bought silence in this city, and he had plenty of both. He laid Grace on the stretcher, watching as the paramedics worked with swift efficiency. Noah tried to climb in after her, but Lorenzo caught him gently. She needs help right now, but she's going to be okay. I promise you that. Noah looked up at him with eyes that held too much understanding for 4 years of life. You saved us. Lorenzo knelt down to the boy's level, his hands resting on small shoulders. I need to tell you something. When I was your age, I hid in a closet too. I prayed for someone to save my mama. And nobody came. Noah's eyes widened. I'm sorry. Lorenzo's throat tightened again. Tonight, you prayed. And I came. Maybe not for me, but for you. Maybe that's how it works. Maybe God sends broken people to save other broken people. Noah's response came with the simple, devastating faith of a child who'd just watched a miracle unfold. God sent you to us. The words hit Lorenzo like lightning. They burned through every rationalization, every excuse, every wall he'd built between himself and the divine. 4 words from a child's mouth, carrying more weight than every sermon he'd ignored, every prayer he'd mocked, every moment he'd declared God dead. God sent you to us. The ambulance doors closed. The vehicle pulled away slowly, its lights still dark, melting into the early morning darkness. Lorenzo stood in the street with Noah's hand in his, watching until the taillights disappeared around the corner. The boy would ride with one of his men to the hospital. But for this moment, they stood together in the aftermath of violence and mercy, 2 survivors of different wars bound by the same impossible rescue. Lorenzo looked up at the sky. Stars, barely visible through the city's light pollution. His mother's face flickered in his memory. Her last words. Her dying prayer. The promise she'd made about broken helpers and helpless children. His voice came out as a whisper, carried on the night air like a confession, like a prayer, like a vow finally fulfilled. Mama, I kept the promise. Grace survived the night, but her recovery stretched across months of surgeries, physical therapy, and psychological healing. She never asked how the hospital bills disappeared, how her room became private, or why security guards she didn't recognize watched her floor with military precision. She knew. Lorenzo never visited during those first weeks. He worked from the shadows, the way he'd always operated. Anonymous payments, quiet relocations. By the time Grace was discharged, a modest but secure home waited for her and Noah in a neighborhood where Lorenzo's influence ensured their safety. Guards rotated in unmarked vehicles. Threats were neutralized before they materialized. Shane was never heard from again, but Noah asked for Lorenzo every single day. Where's the man who saved us? When is he coming back? I want to say thank you. Grace would smile through her healing bruises and tell her son to be patient, that good people were often busy doing good things. On the 43rd day, Lorenzo knocked on their new door. Noah opened it and launched himself at Lorenzo's legs with the full force of 4-year-old joy. Uncle Enzo, you came back. The name stuck. Uncle Enzo. Lorenzo Hale, who'd made grown men weep with fear, who'd built an empire on blood and intimidation, became Uncle Enzo to a little boy with curly hair and gap-toothed smiles. Lorenzo visited twice a week at first, then 3 times, then more often than he visited his own penthouse. He taught Noah small things that his own father never taught him. How to tie shoes properly, how to shake hands with confidence, how to be brave when the nightmares came. Grace watched from the kitchen, her hands wrapped around coffee mugs, her prayers whispered in the quiet moments when Lorenzo thought she wasn't looking. One evening, as Lorenzo helped Noah with a puzzle at the dining table, Grace sat across from them and spoke words that cut through his defenses. I pray for you every night. Lorenzo's hands stilled over the puzzle pieces. You don't need to do that. Yes, I do. Grace's voice carried gentle certainty. You saved our lives, but you're wounded too. I can see it. God sends unusual angels sometimes, broken ones, scarred ones, the kind that understand darkness because they've lived in it. Lorenzo couldn't meet her eyes. His throat tightened with the same emotion that had ambushed him in that hallway months ago. I'm not an angel. Maybe not, Grace smiled softly. But you answered a prayer. That makes you something. 3 weeks later, Noah presented Lorenzo with a drawing. Crayon marks covered construction paper in the chaotic artistry of childhood. A tall figure in a dark suit, and behind him, sketched in yellow and white, wings. That's you, Uncle Enzo. You're my angel. Lorenzo stared at the drawing, his vision blurring. He'd seen death. He'd dealt death. He'd stood over graves he'd filled and felt nothing. But this simple crayon drawing from a child's hand shattered him in ways violence never could. Grace appeared beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. Thank you. For everything. For coming that night. For not giving up on us. For choosing to be the man your mother raised instead of the man your father created. Lorenzo's jaw clenched. Tears threatened again. But this time, they felt different. Not the grief of 30 years. Not the pain of buried trauma. Something else. Something that felt disturbingly like healing. That evening, Grace showed Lorenzo something on her phone. Her old contact list synced from an iCloud account she'd forgotten existed. She scrolled to a number labeled Angel, Lorenzo's number. "I never put this in my phone," Grace whispered, her eyes wide with realization. "The account synced automatically months ago from my old phone. I don't even remember how your number got saved as this." They stared at the screen together. Angel? A glitch? A coincidence? Or something infinitely more intentional? The wrong number that was never wrong at all. Lorenzo's hand trembled as he touched the screen. "Your mother knew," Grace said softly. "Somehow, somewhere, she knew you'd answer when it mattered most." The next Sunday, Lorenzo did something he hadn't done in 25 years. He walked into a church. It was small, nearly empty, filled with morning light that streamed through stained glass windows. Noah held his hand on one side, Grace on the other. Lorenzo sat in the back pew, rigid and uncomfortable, surrounded by hymns he'd forgotten and prayers he'd abandoned. But he stayed. And when Noah looked up at him and smiled, squeezing his hand with tiny fingers, Lorenzo felt something shift in his chest. A door opening. A light penetrating decades of darkness. The faintest whisper of redemption. Over the following months, money began flowing from anonymous accounts into shelters for abused women and children. Buildings were purchased. Programs were funded. Lives were changed by a donor whose name appeared nowhere on the paperwork. Lorenzo Hale, the Mafia boss, the killer, the monster, became something else in the quiet moments between his old life and his new one. He became Uncle Enzo, the man who came when called, the broken angel who'd finally found his purpose. 6 months after that desperate text message, Noah ran to Lorenzo during one of his visits and threw his arms around him with the uninhibited love only children possess. "Uncle Enzo, thank you for coming. Thank you for saving us." Lorenzo knelt down, his expensive suit wrinkling on the floor, his scarred hands cradling the small boy who'd changed everything. "I'll always come for you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Always." Noah smiled against his shoulder, and somewhere in the distance, Lorenzo could have sworn he heard his mother's voice one final time. "Well done, my son, well done." Sometimes God sends angels disguised as broken men. Sometimes the wrong number is heaven's number. And sometimes the prayers of a terrified child reach across decades of darkness to resurrect the soul of a man who thought he'd lost his forever. Lorenzo Hale learned that night that redemption doesn't arrive in thunder and lightning. It arrives in a text message from a 4-year-old boy, and it changes everything.